Blood and Faith, the Unromantic History of the Crusades. Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to the podcast Blood and Faith. When we hear about the Crusades, our minds often conjure images of noble knights in shining armor, venturing to distant lands to fight for the Holy Sepulchre. We think of Hollywood films filled with romance and heroic deeds. But what if I told you that behind this glittering facade lies a history soaked in blood, dirt, and unprecedented cruelty? A history where religious fanaticism walked in hand with greed, where great heroes were ruthless killers, and where holy pilgrimage turned into bloody slaughter and even cannibalism. Today, we will cast aside the romantic veil and dive into the harsh reality of the First Crusade, which began over 900 years ago. We will discover what drove tens of thousands of Europeans to leave their homes and embark on a deadly journey to the Middle East. We will walk with them every step of the way, from the grim, fractured Europe to the walls of sacred Jerusalem. This will not be a tale of saints, but of people, with all their passions, faith, and vices. Make yourselves comfortable. Our journey into the past begins now. Chapter 1. Europe on the Eve of the Storm. To understand why this crusade began, let's first examine what Europe was like in 1095. Forget about modern cities and roads. This was a Europe largely covered in dense forests, with few paths beyond the old Roman roads. It was a Europe where kings were weaker than their vassals, dukes and counts, each with their own armies and domains. England and Scotland were not yet united, and much of Spain was under Moorish control. Christianity dominated, but not everywhere. Half of Norway and Sweden were still pagan. Imagine a king who had converted to Catholicism visiting the interior of his own country, only to have locals offer him a human sacrifice to seal an alliance. This was a feudally fragmented, impoverished, and deeply superstitious Europe, mired in constant internal wars. People's knowledge of the world was virtually non-existent. Residents of Paris or Cologne genuinely believed that just 100 kilometers away lived people with dogs' heads, or even worse, Jews. Europe was in its dark ages. Against this backdrop, the Church held colossal status and influence. The Pope was seen as the first man after God, a figure who crowned kings and emperors. For the common person, the Church was everything: a news center, a place for socializing, and the sole source of protection and comfort. Peasants lived miserable lives, entirely dependent on feudal lords and burdened by taxes like the taille, where a lord could demand money at any time, say for his daughter's wedding. The situation was worsened by terrible famines. For 5 or 7 years in a row, Europe suffered disastrous harvests. There was nothing to eat. People died, and it even led to cannibalism. Yes, people literally ate each other, driven to desperation. Any comet in the sky or bad harvest was seen as God's curse, and the clergy skillfully exploited this, seeking power not just over souls, but also over the secular world. Another massive problem in Europe was the law of primogeniture. This meant the eldest son of a feudal lord inherited everything: land, castles, money. But what were the younger sons to do? They had no intention of tilling the soil. All they knew was how to swing a sword. As a result, they either became mercenaries in internecine wars or banded together into marauding gangs that robbed merchants, pilgrims, and peasants alike. Europe was overrun with these nightly bandits, and something had to be done to channel their energy into a larger war. Chapter 3. God Wills It. Pope Urban II was not only a spiritual leader, but also a shrewd politician. He wanted more than just to help Byzantium. He aimed to strengthen his power in the struggle with the Holy Roman Emperor over investiture, the right to appoint bishops and abbots. Whoever appointed the bishops controlled the minds and political power in the region. Moreover, for several years, rumors had been circulating in Europe that the Seljuk Turks were brutally oppressing Christians in Jerusalem, the holiest site in Christendom. It was said they desecrated holy places and killed and tortured pilgrims. Of course, this was a gross exaggeration. Pilgrims were allowed into Jerusalem for a small fee, but the uneducated and superstitious populace believed these tales. Preachers like Peter the Hermit fueled the fire with their fiery speeches about the horrors supposedly occurring in the Holy Land. By 1095, the idea of reconquering Jerusalem had become one of the era's central spiritual imperatives. The situation was ready to explode. All it needed was a spark. That spark ignited on November 26, 1095, in the French city of Clermont. Pope Urban II delivered a speech that changed the course of history. He addressed the Frankish people, recounting the terrible atrocities committed by an alien race on Christian lands. He painted horrifying pictures. They defile altars with their excrement, circumcise Christians, and throw the circumcised parts into the altars, piercing their bellies, depriving them of their genitals. It was a masterful piece of propaganda. It had everything: the image of a cruel enemy desecrating holy sites, a call for vengeance, an economic motive. This land you inhabit is constricted by your numbers, but there the land flows with milk and honey. Essentially, he said, there are too many of you here, killing each other over scraps of land, but there untold riches await. And finally, the clincher. He promised full remission of sins to all who joined the crusade. The effect was staggering. The crowd went into a frenzy, chanting, "God wills it." This was the event of the century, unfolding in real time. The idea of the crusade gripped everyone, peasants and nobles alike. Notably, not a single king participated in the First Crusade. They were likely relieved that all these rebellious barons and landless younger sons would be occupied elsewhere, bringing peace to their kingdoms. Instead of kings, the crusade was led by powerful lords: Raymond of Toulouse, Godfrey of Bouillon, Robert of Normandy, the eldest son of William the Conqueror, who was so obsessed with the crusade he pawned all his Normandy to raise an army. Among them was also Hugh the Great, who, through his mother Anna of Kiev, was a grandson of Yaroslav the Wise. Chapter 4. The Peasants Crusade. The Pope set the official start of the crusade for August 15, 1096. But the first to set out, without waiting for the knights, were vast crowds of peasants. They were led by the monk Peter the Hermit. These were tens of thousands of people. Some sources say up to 100,000. People unskilled in warfare, fleeing famine, poverty, and feudal oppression. Their crusade began, strangely enough, with Jewish pogroms in Germany, as they loosely interpreted the Pope's call to fight infidels. These were the first recorded mass Jewish pogroms in Europe. Their path then led through Hungary, where they began robbing the locals, for which they were partially slaughtered by Hungarian cavalry. When this enormous, ragged, and starving mob reached Constantinople, it was a shock for the Byzantines. In the wealthy and cultured city, looting and theft erupted. Emperor Alexios hastened to rid himself of such allies. He quickly provided them with boats and ferried them across the strait to Asia Minor, pointing them toward Jerusalem. There, professional warriors, the Seljuk Turks, were waiting. Seeing an army armed with sticks, knives, and stones, they massacred it almost entirely. Between 50,000 and 100,000 people were killed. When the Byzantines arrived at the scene, all they could do was pile the corpses into a massive pyramid 30 meters high. Thus ended the Peasants' Crusade in tragedy and disgrace. Chapter 5. March to Nicaea. Finally, in August 1096, the real warriors set out. Heavy-armored knights with retinues, servants, and women of high and not-so-high social responsibility. Some traveled overland through Hungary. Others sailed on ships provided by Genoese and Venetian merchants. The merchants were keenly interested in the crusade, as it could open new trade routes to the east, which were controlled by Muslims. After nearly a year of travel, the Crusaders reached Constantinople. Emperor Alexios I demanded they swear vassal oaths to him. He said, "Gentlemen, the cities you will recapture from the Turks, Nicaea, Antioch, were formerly Byzantine. Therefore, after taking them, you must return them to me. In return, I will give you money and provisions." Most knights agreed, but some, like the proud Tancred of Taranto, refused, declaring that military spoils belonged to the warrior, and he was not the emperor's vassal. Having reached an agreement, the knights moved toward their first target, Nicaea. It was an arduous journey. Europeans, many of whom had never experienced such heat, suffered in their armor. The Turks poisoned all the wells along the way, causing disease and dysentery in the Crusader army. Many could not endure it and turned back. Finally, in 1097, they besieged Nicaea, a splendidly fortified city surrounded by walls with 300 towers. Count Stephen of Blois wrote to his wife, "We have encountered brave Turkish warriors here, and a countless host of the Lord, which has been fighting the Nicaeans to the death for 4 weeks." The Europeans deployed their full arsenal of siege weapons, trebuchets, ballistas, battering rams, and enormous siege towers. But 3 assaults failed. The main problem was that the city could not be fully blockaded. The Seljuk fleet continuously supplied Nicaea with provisions via the lake. The Crusaders then requested help from the Byzantines. The latter brought their fleet on wagons, launched it into the lake, and cut off the city's supplies. Famine set in within Nicaea, and here Emperor Alexios I outsmarted everyone again. He secretly negotiated with the Turks. "Surrender to me. I guarantee your lives. If the Franks take the city, they will slaughter you all." One morning, the astonished Crusaders saw the gates of Nicaea open and Byzantine soldiers emerging. "Thank you for your help," they were told. "The city is taken. No need to loot. You swore an oath." The knights were furious. They had stood beneath the walls for a month, lost thousands of men, and expected rich plunder. The Byzantines bought them off with gold, but this only convinced the Crusaders of how much they had lost. relations between the allies were irreparably damaged. Chapter 6. 8 months of hell at Antioch. Having been denied plunder in Nicaea, some crusaders decided to take their spoils elsewhere. This perfectly illustrates the morals of the time's warriors. Tancred of Taranto captured and looted the city of Tarsus with his detachment. But then another crusader, Baldwin of Boulogne, arrived with a larger force and essentially seized most of the loot from Tancred. In response, Tancred looted another fortress and ambushed Baldwin's troops to reclaim the spoils. The quarrel between the leaders was stopped by ordinary knights who were outraged. "We came here to liberate the Holy Sepulchre, and you are fighting each other over gold." The army moved on to their next great target, Antioch. This was an even more formidable fortress than Nicaea, with a citadel inside the city walls. The siege of Antioch lasted a grueling 8 months. 8 months of exhausting battles, hunger, and disease. Nothing worked. The city was only taken thanks to betrayal. An armorer named Firuz, bribed by the Crusaders, opened the gates of one of the towers at night. Storming into the city, the Crusaders unleashed a massacre, slaughtering defenders and civilians alike. They drowned Antioch in blood, doing what they had been denied in Nicaea. But they could not take the citadel within the city. And at that very moment, the Crusaders found themselves trapped. A massive Arab army led by the general Kerboga approached and besieged them inside the captured Antioch. The situation became desperate. The Crusaders were caught between the citadel at their rear and Kerboga's army outside. In the city, full of unburied corpses, a typhus epidemic broke out. There was no food. It even led to cannibalism. Desertions began. Even the famous preacher, Peter the Hermit, tried to flee by lowering himself down the wall on a rope. But Tancred caught him and, threatening to cut off his legs, forced him to return and boost the troops' morale. The Crusades' leaders were at a loss. Kerboga had far more troops. It seemed all was lost. And here, religious fanaticism took center stage once more. A cunning monk claimed he had a vision. In one of Antioch's churches was buried the lance of destiny, the very lance that pierced Christ on the cross. Of course, the monk had buried it there himself beforehand. After 3 days of fasting and prayer, the lance was miraculously found. This miracle had an incredible effect. For the dark, exhausted, and superstitious army, it was a sign from above. Inspired by the discovery of the holy relic, the Crusaders, despite being outnumbered, all rushed out of Antioch's gates and charged at Kerboga's army. The Arabs, unprepared for such a fierce and suicidal assault, faltered and fled. The Crusaders pursued and killed them, then took the citadel, completing the massacre in the city. To the Muslim world, they were now firmly established as stinking, fanatical, and savage barbarians who spared no one and waged war with unparalleled cruelty, wiping out civilian populations entirely. Chapter 7. The Bloody Assault on Jerusalem. After the capture of Antioch, discord broke out again among the Crusaders. Bohemond of Taranto refused to go further and stayed to rule the captured city. Baldwin of Boulogne also chose to remain in his new county of Edessa. Some leaders even returned home with their troops. The Crusader army, worn down by the siege, typhus, and internal strife, was greatly diminished. Nevertheless, they pressed on toward their ultimate goal. Early on the morning of June 7, 1099, 3 years after the crusade began, an army of about 40,000 approached the walls of Jerusalem. According to eyewitnesses, upon seeing the holy city, many knights fell to their knees and wept. The religious fervor was unprecedented. But Jerusalem was even better fortified than Antioch. The first assault attempt on June 13th failed. The walls were lined with sacks of cotton that cushioned the impact of stones and arrows. The situation changed when Genoese ships arrived at the port with provisions and, more importantly, tools to build siege towers. Before the decisive assault, the Crusader leaders staged an incredible psychological spectacle. On July 8th, they donned sackcloth and walked barefoot in a procession around Jerusalem's walls, singing psalms. Imagine the impression this made on the defenders. In response, they hurled curses, further enraging the already frenzied Crusaders. Under a hail of arrows, the Crusaders filled the moat around the city, set fire to the cotton sacks on the walls, and brought massive siege towers right up to the fortifications. The decisive assault began on July 14th. Particularly terrifying to the defenders were the crossbowmen. At that time, the crossbow was considered so deadly in Europe that the Pope had banned its use in wars between Christians. But against pagans and infidels, it was permitted. The assault lasted all day and all night. On the morning of July 15th, after a joint prayer that sounded to the besieged like a death knell, the Crusaders launched their final attack. From a siege tower, knights landed on the wall. One of the first to scale Jerusalem's wall was our old acquaintance, Tancred. A breach was made in the wall, and within an hour the Crusaders stormed into the city. What followed defies description. It was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The city was literally drowned in blood. There is a famous saying that the horses of the Turkish conquerors in Constantinople waded knee-deep in blood. Well, this phrase was first uttered about Jerusalem in 1099. The Crusaders spared no one, not women, not children, not the elderly. They burst into homes, killed all the inhabitants, seized their property, and hung their shields on the doors to mark the house as occupied and looted. The massacre continued all night and into the next day. The sacred city was taken, and the First Crusade ended in unprecedented bloodshed. Chapter 8. Legacy of Fire and Sword. After the capture of Jerusalem, Godfrey of Bouillon became the ruler of the new state. However, he refused the title of king, saying he could not wear a golden crown in the city where Jesus wore a crown of thorns, and instead took the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. Soon, another relic was found, the life-giving cross, sparking a new wave of religious enthusiasm. After defeating an approaching Egyptian army, the Crusaders secured their position. Considering their duty fulfilled, most knights returned home. Robert of Normandy, by the way, married advantageously in Italy and used the rich dowry to buy back his Normandy. What were the consequences of this crusade? In the east, several Crusader states emerged: the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and the County of Tripoli. The Crusades also gave rise to powerful knightly orders, the Templars, the Hospitallers, and the Teutonic Order, which would later fight our ancestors. The French historian Jacques Le Goff wryly noted that the only benefit of the Crusades was introducing Europeans to the apricot. Of course, that's not entirely true. Europeans did gain access to Eastern knowledge in medicine, mathematics, and architecture. They also adopted everyday habits, such as bathing more frequently. Trade links between Europe and the East flourished. That was the positive side.
but the negative consequences undoubtedly outweigh them. There were enormous human losses and the destruction of cultural monuments. Most importantly, the Crusades planted a deep seed of national and religious enmity between the West and the East. This conflict, sown over 900 years ago, would echo through the centuries, and we still hear its reverberations today. The First Crusade indeed was different from those that followed. Most of its participants sincerely went to fight for their faith. But as we have seen, their journey was devoid of any romance and became a brutal event that showed how merciless humans can be when hiding behind the name of God. The subsequent 7 Crusades would increasingly resemble wars of conquest for plunder and territory, with kings now taking part. But that, as they say, is a story for another time. With that, we conclude today's deep and, I hope, honest conversation about the First Crusade. We have seen how a complex interplay of faith, politics, poverty, and greed gave birth to one of the most dramatic and controversial phenomena in world history. Thank you for spending this time with us and delving into this challenging topic. History is rarely black and white, and our goal is to see it in all its multifaceted and sometimes shocking fullness. Stay with us. Subscribe to the podcast Blood and Faith so you don't miss future episodes, where we will continue to explore the most ambiguous pages of the past. Ahead lie many more mysteries, feats, and crimes committed under the banner of the cross. Until next time on the air.